Here's my thoughts on the SEC and the other Power 5 conferences. My thought is let's put the results and the performance to the side for just a second. Of course, that's most important, but the sheer talent in the SEC tells us that it's probably the best conference. Again, we'll get to the results because they're most important. The SEC recruits the best players. It's not even close with the other leagues. If you look at the recruiting rankings over and over and over, again, the recruiting rankings are flawed if you look at any one particular player, but in mass, they are very telling because the recruiting rankings translate 3 to 4 years later right into the NFL draft. The SEC by far has the most players drafted into the NFL and by far recruits and has the most top 300 players signed by SEC teams. That can't be debated. Now, whether that is manifested on the field, well, let's take a look. I am going to provide a complete breakdown of the results between the Power 5 leagues as I do each and every offseason. But for right now, Deep Barrett makes a good point about the Big 12's performance against the SEC in bowl play. And I think bowl play, more so than other people, is a pretty substantial barometer. Yes, there are more guys sitting out than ever before. But if you look at those players versus the overall amount of personnel on each team, it's pretty minuscule. There are some exceptions. Michigan had a big drain on its team with Karan Higdon and Devin Bush and Rashawn Gary not playing for Michigan against Florida. It doesn't excuse the loss, but it can be understood. It can be put in a different context. I don't know what to do with that game in particular because you're talking about a 1,000-yard rusher, the best defensive lineman in the conference, and probably one of the top 2 or 3 linebackers in the country. So that's difficult to deal with in the Michigan scenario against Florida. This is a program that trounced Florida twice in the last 3 years, and then they lose 41-15 without 6 of their best players. But other than that, when the teams are healthy or near healthy, think about this. In the regular season, the Power 5 conferences play regular season games against each other that were scheduled 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 years ago. So therefore, we very rarely have like-seeded matchups. It was nice in 2016 and 17 to see Ohio State, the best team in the Big Ten, play Oklahoma, the best team in the Big 12. And what happened? Well, Ohio State went to Norman and blew the doors off them. Oklahoma won decidedly in Columbus the next year. So at least we got to see number 1 seeds in 2 conferences play each other, and we could make a reasonable conclusion out of that series. Because most of the time, because we don't know, and this is what's wrong with scheduling in college football, that it's left up to the schools. Who was Oklahoma's major non-conference game? Well, it turned out to be Army, actually, but based on face value and brand and conference affiliation, it was UCLA. That was Oklahoma's big matchup this year. Well, there's no way to compare the Pac-12 and the Big 12 based on that game. It means nothing in regards to what we're talking about here, and that's comparing conferences. That's why bowl season is so beautiful, among other things, is that it provides at least an arena, at least a portion of games that we can draw some level of conclusion because all the teams are like-seeded. Now, it doesn't work out perfectly because sometimes, especially those teams that are those conferences that have teams that elevate into the college football playoff, and especially in the old BCS, you had the Big Ten and the SEC with way more teams elevated into the major bowls, and over the last few years into the New Year's Six than the other conferences, and then therefore they had their lower seeded teams playing higher seeded, but not by much, by 1 or 2 spots. So to Deep Barrett's point, the Big 12 with like-seeded teams going up against the SEC won 3 of 4 games. We don't even get that kind of comparison on the last weekend of the season when 4 ACC teams play 4 SEC teams. Louisville, Kentucky, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, South Carolina, Clemson. Because what do we have? We've got Clemson, by far the best team in the ACC, playing South Carolina, who, let's say, was the 8th or ninth best team in the SEC. Well, you can't draw a conclusion from that game. And then you've got Kentucky, who's actually this year one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the SEC, playing Louisville, who is by far the worst team in the ACC. So we can't draw a conclusion from that game. Georgia, the second or third best team in the SEC, playing Georgia Tech, who's not bad, 7-5, but they lost to Minnesota in a bowl game. They're not that good, 7-6. So we can't make anything out of that game. All the games meant nothing in terms of trying to extract a conclusion of conference dominance or power. But the bowl games give that to us. When Oklahoma State plays Missouri, they're very like-seeded teams in both of those conferences. Obviously, when Alabama and Oklahoma played, that was the best team in the SEC going up against the best team in the Big 12. The other matchups, Vandy and Baylor, very like-seeded teams, both went 6-6. And the other game that I'm missing would have been Texas, Georgia, of course. Texas and Georgia. Texas lost its conference championship game. Georgia lost the SEC championship game. Perfect matchup. Was Georgia motivated? Did they care to be there? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to conjecture. That's too bad for them. They should have shown up. They're athletes. They're competitors. If there's a game to be played, especially when millions and millions and millions and millions of people are watching, and it's at the Sugar Bowl and people are going to remember that game, you know what? Don't make excuses. Show up and play. Show that you're a competitor. So the Big 12 showed out against the SEC. There is no doubt about that in those 4 games, but it's a very limited sample. Very limited sample. We did, I believe, have 2 other games between the conferences. I can think of 3 more. West Virginia beat Tennessee. Well, West Virginia was one of the very best teams in the Big 12, probably number 2 or 3. I know they didn't get to the championship game, but they did beat Texas. So the second or third best team in the Big 12 beat Tennessee, who was near the bottom of the SEC. So we can't draw much from that game. Ole Miss and Texas Tech, pretty like-seeded matchup there. Ole Miss blew their doors off. So that brings the SEC up into the conversation a little bit more. Then the other game, of course, was Mississippi State against Kansas State. Not a fair matchup there, with Kansas State having an off year at 5-7, Mississippi State 8-4. It's a fun conversation. I love it. I think it means something. It certainly means something to SEC fans. I don't know that the other conferences have fan bases that are quite as unified. We don't hear folks chanting Big 10 or Big 12 or Pac-12. It just doesn't roll off the lips either. But ACC, they could chant ACC, but we only hear chants for the SEC. Off the top of my head, do not hold me to this. Off the top of my head, I would go SEC, Big 10, Big 12. Man, I think the ACC is pretty bad. ACC, Pac-12. Is somebody going to rise up in the next few years and challenge Clemson in the ACC? It's reasonable to think that somebody will in the SEC. Jimbo Fisher's at Texas A&M, recruiting out of his mind. LSU is LSU. Auburn is usually strong. On the other side, Georgia, Florida. Dan Mullen's doing a nice job at Florida. Kentucky, not necessarily what I think that they're going to challenge Alabama, but they'll be somewhat strong, you would think. Mark Stoops has something going there. That there's just so many strong programs in the SEC. You look at the ACC, I see nothing past Clemson. Who else has a good program right this second? Well, Florida State, I believe, Will Lee. Even if he's not the guy, they'll get rid of him if he goes 5-7 again. He might be gone next year. Or let's say a 7-5 and a 7-5 the next 2 years might get him out the door, and then they'll get somebody that they need. And I'm not saying that Willie Taggart's not the guy at Florida State. I'm just saying considering the first year that he had there, if he's not the guy, then it's not going to take more than 2 years for him to be out the door. And Florida State, as we well know, they are the most prepared in terms of tradition, talent, recruiting base more than anything, resources, money, everything involved, facilities, the most equipped to challenge Clemson long term. But they're 59-10 eons away from Clemson right now. So who in the world in the ACC is going to challenge Clemson? Whereas Alabama, I can see being challenged by all those schools that I just mentioned, especially LSU, Texas A&M, and Auburn. And then by extension in the championship game, Florida and Georgia. At least there's 5 schools in the SEC that you don't have to make a huge stretch to say they could challenge Bama in the next 2 to 3 years. In the ACC, I would put my money on Florida State just because of the obvious advantages that that program has, but they're not the closest right now. Who's the closest? Nobody's even close. Yeah, Syracuse played them close on one Saturday afternoon without Trevor Lawrence on the field in the second half, but they are not close. Nobody's close. Pitt won the other division.